a new phase here, namely cell division. So around the turn of the century of the last century, not this century, 1900, people noticed, looking into a microscope, that they saw cells that were, well, splitting in two. So on the right is a plant cell, on the left is an animal cell, both, but they're both doing the same sort of thing. And they didn't really know, of course, what that was or anything like that. They didn't know what it was made of. Eventually it was Crick and Watson who discovered, the structure of DNA. So they did isolate DNA, but they didn't really know if it was actually the molecule for heredity. But anyway, so they started proposing various hypotheses for what was going on. They knew it was cell division, but they didn't know what these structures were. They knew somewhat what it was made of, namely they broke it up and they'd see sugar phosphate on the spectrograph and a few other things. So anyway, eventually, and they saw various examples, on their microscope of cells dividing. And they had hypotheses for it, but they didn't really know until Crick and Watson actually showed what the structure of DNA was. And that, in fact, in the middle there, those chromosomes were actually all a long, long, long strand of DNA. So we could ask a number of questions. What does a cell need to reproduce? Well, first of all, remember, does each cell have only the genes it needs or all the genes?
It has all the genes.
Right. So it needs to copy that. That's for sure. If it's going to divide into another cell, it needs to copy all the DNA so that the new cell, the daughter cell, has exactly the same DNA, right? Now normally, if you look at a cell under a microscope, you cannot see any DNA. Because the DNA is not condensed, it's all spread out. It's there, but it's only visible when it actually condenses, and that's when it's actually replicating. And then, in terms of the cell cycle, they started coming up with ideas about what's happening. Obviously, cells aren't dividing all the time, but some of the time, and something is governing that. And so they needed to figure out what was actually, let's say, what the cell cycle, life cycle, not just the life cycle, but the reproductive cycle was actually doing. Now this isn't reproduction in terms of reproduction. This is cells dividing, copying and dividing themselves into new cells, because our cells wear out. So this is actually showing DNA that's partly condensed. And that's so that if it was all condensed, there would be nothing that was exposed that you could actually get it to produce proteins. It would be too tight, everything would be blocked. So what happens is it's uncondensed, and then the actual proteins that are needed are made. Okay. So when DNA gets condensed, it looks like this. And these are so this is a whole chromosome. Oh, come on. And this is a whole chromosome. There's two of them. Why?
Would it be like one from the mom and dad?
Yeah, exactly. Good. So in this case, these are homologous chromosomes. Homologous means same. They have the exact same genes on them. They might have different alleles. And you get one from each parent when there's actual sexual reproduction. So they come together and form a zygote, which is diploid. Okay? And then, so each of these single chromosomes is actually called a sister chromatid. And then in each one, there's also a centromere. And then there's also, this is the long arm, oops, here, hold on. Okay. Hold on, I'm screwing up. Okay. So that's, the top one is the long arm of the DNA chromosome, and the bottom one is the short arm. And there's genes all along there. Okay. So in order for a cell to produce a copy of itself, it must replicate, it must condense, and divide the copied DNA into two cells, and that's actually called mitosis. And we'll take a little. Oh, that's not going to help. Oh, come on. Forget it. God damn it. Shit. Okay, so G1, S, and G2. And that little short film told us what was going on. Okay. So most of our cells, like I said, cell divided in two. Now, cells divide because there are proteins that are called signaling proteins. And so, when that protein is made and it binds to the cell, part of the cell, it's kind of like, okay, you have to replicate. Now, why exactly might cells divide? Any ideas? Let's
To repair itself?
repair? That's great. Okay. Anything else?
Reproduction?
Mm-hmm. Anything else? It's kind of like repair, but it's cells wear out. Also, sometimes you need new cells. So we'll say okay. So there's a cell cycle, and then like I mentioned, some cells need to be replaced all the time, like skin cells, and others are only replaced rarely, if at all. They have to do it during, like we said, during reproduction. So and then lifespan. So they get signals. And these are the kind of signals that they actually get. Okay. So, like I said, epithelial cells, days, blood cells, months, muscle cells and cells of the organs, years, neurons almost never. Now, it's not entirely true because obviously we have memories, and memories are not just something out in the ether. They're all based on a physical process. So memories have to be laid down, and they're done with these different proteins, and then retrieved. And some are in short-term memory, and some are in long-term storage. Hold on a second. Oh, there's all other things going on too. Some cells might just get lonely, and they want someone to keep them company. Another is that this whole cell division is supposed to be very, very tightly controlled. But it's not sometimes, and that's when we get cancer. So cancer is uncontrolled cell division. It's essentially all multicellular life has the potential to have cells go rogue and become cancerous. In fact, I would even say a single cell, a lot of the same things could happen. So remember, when a cell actually needs to reproduce, it needs energy and it needs the resources to do it, and it won't go into the G2 phase unless that's when it's acquiring all the energy that it needs. If it doesn't have it, it won't be very successful in the cell division. So you might even have single-cell eukaryotic organisms that instead of going through their normal division in the cycle, they kind of start skipping phases and not having enough energy and all that. And obviously, they're not going to survive, but that's the same sort of process that happens with multicellular organisms. And also, it turns out that multicellular organisms, because of this kind of fundamental problem, actually have a whole bunch of systems in place to stop it from happening. And we'll get to that later. Okay. Now, there are genes that promote cell division. They're called proto-oncogenes. I don't really like the term oncogene. Onco means cancer. And it's not like all these genes are there to cause cancer. Okay? There's these genes that control cell division. We call them oncogenes, proto, because they haven't done it. They haven't gone crazy yet, but there's always a possibility. Like the on phase is initiated and it's kept on, and cells keep dividing and dividing. Okay. So they got the signal, they promote cell division. Okay, let me go back here. If you notice that in G1, well, there's kind of a checkpoint. Here, there's also a couple of checkpoints here, and then there's also a checkpoint in mitosis. So these checkpoints, they kind of take stock and see, is the cell doing what it's supposed to do? If it's starting to show that it's like hinky and a rogue, it will stop the process and the cell will be destroyed. Now, obviously, our cells during development, they divide many, 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 many times. Remember, you're starting with a single cell, a fertilized egg, and that then goes through the whole developmental stages. So you get 2 cells, and then 4, and then 6, 8, and then 16. And at a certain point, the cells start to differentiate. So remember, there's all these different kinds of cells in our body. Now, during development, there's these master genes. We talked a little bit about them a long time ago. They're called Hox genes. And they control how the body the body plan. So, like limb buds have to happen at a certain time and place, and they control other genes that then express like growth factors. And so it's kind of a whole play. If it goes wrong, then you end up with an organism that's not, it's unviable, right? Okay. So all this differentiation is going on, finally. Oh, and some of this differentiation, by the way, goes on past the time of being born. Because there's cell development. Remember, you guys are kind of coming to the end of your developmental phase. It takes a long time for humans to get to, you know, reproductive age and act as adults and all that. Okay, now, a cell can go crazy, and it can kind of start dividing. Now, a lot of cells, not only do they get a signal to divide, but they also get a signal to stop. So there's signaling proteins to start and stop, both. Sometimes cells, they keep dividing. They either don't get a signal, but there's a whole bunch of mechanisms that actually stop this from happening. Okay. Now, there's also another thing that I want to get you to get your heads around. Evolution, natural selection acts on what? The individual or the population? Individual, and then populations evolve. Okay. Instead of looking at a multicellular organism as an individual, we can go down and we can say, oh, this tissue has a population of cells. And each of those cells is an individual. And if we start to think about it that way in terms of cancer, we can say, oh, okay, evolution might actually work the same way. There might be traits that certain cells acquire, let's say, through a mutation or something like that, that allow them to divide uncontrollably. Now, I'm not, you know, we think of natural selection as weeding out the bad and doing the good. Well, this is kind of the opposite. In the end, if a cell creates a tumor, and tumors spread all over the body, the cell and the rest of the whole organism is going to die. So that's why evolution doesn't happen for a reason. It's just a process. That's all it is. And in this case, you can actually have cells. Think of cells as individuals. Something happens to the cell, and it keeps on growing. It leaves many, many, many more copies of itself than the other cells around it that are behaving themselves. So eventually, you're going to get all these cells that are dividing uncontrollably because of this mutation that they inherited, and you're going to get a formation of a tumor. So in other words, selection is actually favoring, in terms of cell growth, tumor formation. That the fact that it ultimately leads to death is besides the point. That's how evolution happens. So it's got a trait. Each cell has these different traits. Okay. Okay. So we have a system that stops this rogue behavior. And how can it get broken? Well, I mentioned a little bit about the checkpoints. And of course, one thing in terms of getting broken is they can receive, let's say, the wrong signal. Okay. Let's see. Oh, some cancers are heritable. So, like this cancer called retinoblastoma, it's on one of the somatic cells, and it causes a tumor to form, and it's very hereditary, and if it's the hereditary form, usually it's both eyes are eventually going to develop these tumors, and they're going to have to be taken out. So the individual is blind. Okay, so let me think here. What do I want to call it? Fuck, I lost my train of thought. Okay, so wrong signal. Oh, that's right. So let's see, wrong signal, heredity. Oh, obviously damage. So let's say a cell gets damaged. And let's say radiation, gamma rays from fission. So cells get damaged from gamma rays, and it might cause problems in the DNA, and the cell starts to divide uncontrollably. Now, most of the time when there's damage like that, the cell just dies. It's made to die, but not always. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, most mutations arise during your lifetime. Now remember, there are germline mutations that are passed along from parent to offspring. But it doesn't mean that mutations suddenly stop there. The somatic cells and the germline cells that we have, when they divide, they can also generate mutations. A letter, one of the DNA letters gets changed, you have a change in an amino acid and a protein, something like that. You can end up with mutations that make a cell susceptible. Okay, so this is during the cell's lifetime. Most of these mutations are what are called sporadic. They happen just during cell division. Others are inherited. So you inherit a gene that makes it likely that with the right environment, you're more likely to get cancer than someone else. Or someone has a mutation that makes the tumor suppressor system stop working. Okay. So inheritance can be so here's some questions. Is it genetic? So we'll just go on. Is it environmental? It can be, right? You could be unfortunate enough to, let's say, live very high up on a mountain where the gamma rays and ultraviolet rays are much more intense because there's less atmosphere, and you might actually end up getting skin cancer or something like that, right? So, like skin cancer, a lot of sun, things in your environment like smoking, okay? In this case, you purposely ingest carcinogens. You don't want to do that, but it's good. It tastes good, right? Okay. Now, is cancer contagious? No, but yes. Okay. For the most part, any cancers that we have are not contagious. It's like you can't just pick it up from someone else, like you can a cold. It turns out dogs have this contagious cancer. It's not very serious, but they can pass it on from one to another when they're playing and biting each other and all that. It turns out also that a lot of clams and things like that, it appears that they have a cancer that can be contagious. And then in Tasmania, an island off of Australia, they have an animal called the Tasmanian devil. And when they have sex, it's a very violent sort of thing. You know, the kind of thing that Donald Trump gets in trouble with. Anyway, it is, and during that time, they actually, a cancer developed, no one knows when, but it was pretty recent, and it's been spreading through the population, and it's not mild, it's actually a fatal disease, and they're trying to stop it. So, and they have a pretty good plan for doing it, but in the meantime, the population of these Tasmanian devils has really dropped because of this cancer. Also, it turns out they might have found some individuals who are somewhat resistant to the cancer mutation, right? Beneficial mutation. Those individuals leave more offspring. Eventually, the whole population will evolve to resist the cancer. Okay. Is cancer on the rise? There are certainly some kinds of cancer that are on the rise. Do you remember when we talked about correlation doesn't equal causation? And we had a situation where we said seat belts cause cancer. Well, one of the reasons it's on the rise is that people live longer and they have more time to develop cancer, and it turns out in old age, your tumor suppressor system isn't working as well. So there's just more cancers there because of that. But then there's other questions about on the rise in general, and there's certainly some kinds of cancers that you find in clusters that are due to environmental toxins that weren't there, that we've produced. And there's a whole bunch of things that you might have learned in the past about Superfund sites that are being cleaned up or have been cleaned up, that plants were just dumping toxins into the waterways. People were drinking it. They were getting all sorts of diseases. I remember a long time ago, I was on a cross-country trip, and I was like 8 years old or something like that. We went to New Jersey. Now, New Jersey is known to be a toxic waste dump. Okay. Anyway, we went there, and there were these plants along this river, and they were, you could just see it, they were dumping huge amounts of this brown goo that I'm sure had all sorts of toxic metals in it, whatever they were doing. It was terrible. So those kinds of things can certainly cause more cancers. If the ozone layer, now we're stopping this, but if there was an ozone, used to be holes in the ozone because of the chemicals we were releasing, you'd get more rays from the sun, ultraviolet, and so you might get more skin cancers because of that. Now, can your immune system protect you? Well, it turns out yes. That's in fact part of the tumor suppressor system, yeah.
Let's say like my father or my grandparents used to smoke a lot of cigarettes and they're very like used to doing that and they didn't get cancer. Is it possible that I might have a very strong lungs to...
Yeah, look, okay, so the main thing is with a toxin, a carcinogen, what it does is it's got some property that affects an individual cell. So the fact that, let's say, your father and grandfather smoke, doesn't mean that they're just lucky at this point. I think more than anything. Cancer, I mean, there's a really strong link, of course, to tobacco companies, of course. Well, it was just like the climate change thing. They were putting out all sorts of misinformation. But yeah, I think probably, yeah, there might be some little bit of hereditary component, but not much. The fact that do they smoke?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, they're lucky. They haven't gotten cancer. Your grandfather probably has COPD, which is chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, because you're doing more, you're damaging the lungs. So if you smoke, don't. Yeah.
Is it possible that cancer be so like hereditary that eventually, like, your body develops a mutation to it?
Okay. So you have a hereditary cancer,
Like it goes on for so long.
Yeah. Well, it could be that eventually there's a mutation that at the same place or near it that shuts it off, but not during your lifetime. Okay.
No, I'm saying like eventually, like is that possible for it to kind of just
It's
go
pretty
away?
unlikely. It's pretty unlikely. Okay. So it doesn't now. A lot of cancer genes or genes that reasons for cells to become cancerous, they don't have complete what's called penetrance. In other words, they actually cause cancer. So retinoblastoma, the thing I was talking to you about, that has penetrance of about 95%. So almost everybody that sporadically acquires a mutation or is passed on is going to get retinoblastoma. There are other kinds of cancer that are related to, let's say, breast cancer and the BRCA suppressor system. And if there's a mutation in the suppressor system, that's why you get more likely to get breast cancer. So it's not the cell itself, it's the suppressor system that's not functioning properly. The penetrance of that is much lower, anywhere from, I think, 20 to 60%. Well, it doesn't mean cancer. Some cancers are hereditary, but it doesn't mean it's automatic that you're going to get cancer. It just makes it more likely. And then there's the question, let's say you do get cancer, is the treatment worse than the disease? In some cases, yeah, pretty bad. But there's some new stuff going on that we'll discuss later about how they're treating cancer. But, there was a war on cancer, at another war that was started, I think it was by Nixon in the early 70s. We were going to, beat cancer. Well, we're still at war. Okay, so also, it turns out cancer is not one disease, it's like hundreds of different diseases, depending on the cell type and the mutations that they have. So, remember, mutations, they can affect gene expression. They can either stop expression or cause expression of certain genes and then proteins. Like these signaling proteins, you could have a problem there. You could actually alter the function of the protein that this gene codes for. Or, of course, you can have a mutation that has little or no effect. So here's our cell cycle again. Okay. So what are these genes called that might initiate cancer? You guys remember? I mentioned I didn't like the word, but proto-oncogenes. Okay. So which mutation would be the worst? That would actually cause a cell to go haywire. Well, it's probably something that activates it. Now remember, these proto-oncogenes, these are part of, they control cell replication. So it's not like they don't cause cancer. They do have certain functions, and if the functions get messed up, then they can be cancer can be the result of that cause. Now, if a gene, in fact, let's say is stuck on, and it's making a signaling protein and it shouldn't, that's causing cancer, then we can say that that's now turned into not just a proto-oncogene, but a real oncogene. In other words, a gene that is the cause of that cancer. Most of these mutations, of course, they're after reproduction and they're sporadic, unless they're caused by something environmental or something like that. Okay. Now, there are things called tumor suppressor genes, as I mentioned. Literally, all multicellular organisms have something like that, because all multicellular organisms are susceptible to cancer of one gene taking off on its own and replicating madly. So there's cancers in plants, all kinds of animals, multicellular algae, a whole slew of things. Fungi, right? Now, so they've all got different systems. Like a plant tumor suppressor system is different than an animal. A lot of the suppressor systems that you find in animals, whether it's an insect or a human, or share some of the same genes for controlling cell replication. So at this checkpoints, here's this first one in G1, is cell division necessary? So if it's necessary, they get the right signal, it goes on into the rest through interphase and then up to metaphase, mitosis. Now, there's also a G2 checkpoint. There's other things that you want. Are growth factors present? Is the cell large enough? Are there sufficient nutrients available for it to do this? If it doesn't, then it gets a stop checkpoint and it doesn't go beyond that phase. Checkpoint 2, which is right on the edge of G2 and mitosis, was DNA replicated correctly? Again, is the cell large enough and has enough nutrients and energy to actually do it? And then there's something called a metaphase checkpoint. Are all the chromosomes attached to microtubules, which we'll learn about in a bit. So there's these natural checkpoints that are in place to stop cancer cells from going cancerous or forming. If they do, they're stopped during the cycle. And they're actually told to commit suicide, which they do. So this is a cell undergoing mitotic division. The DNA is in the nucleus, right? And this is a non-mitotic cell. This is a dividing cell, though, because you can actually see the chromosome splitting. Okay. Now, tumor suppressor proteins actually stop cell division. They make proteins that do this. One of the best well-known ones is P53. Another is BRCA1 and 2, and there's a bunch of others. So, do you think that mutations that activate or inactivate tumor suppressor genes are dangerous? Which one? Remember, the tumor suppressor system is part of the system that stops cancer in their track. So is it likely that if it's activated, it's working? If it's not, that means it's likely that cancer can arise, but there's nothing to stop it. So it would be inactivate. Okay. So the BRCA1 gene that you're probably, a lot of the women are familiar with, it increases the chances of, if you have an inactive BRCA1, the chances of getting breast cancer and ovarian cancer are much higher. And so the BRCA1 suppressor gene, the mutation inactivates its cancer-stopping function. Now, normally, if it catches a bunch of mistakes, it instructs the cell to commit suicide during those checkpoints. But if it's non-functional, then there's a good chance that someone will actually develop breast cancer during their lifetime. Okay. Now, when a cell commits suicide, it's called apoptosis. Let's see, what's BBC? Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, normal, this normal cell, and then this apoptotic where it actually, the cell actually commits suicide. So the trouble with these tumor suppressor genes being inactivated, it's not like you have one cell that goes crazy, right? It's got something wrong and it's dividing over and over again. Normally that would be stopped, or sometimes not. Now, the thing is, a tumor suppressor gene, if it's not working, it means that it's not working. And because cells are always dividing all the time, some can go crazy, and instead of being stopped, they're not. So when this happens, there's another thing that happens actually too. You have the BRCA gene is not suppressing tumors, and so a cell has a mutation. And that cell has a little bit of a hinky mutation. And then during division, it might have more and more mutations that are coming along. And the mutations actually accumulate. So it's usually not a single mutation that's going to cause cancer. It's usually a whole bunch of mutations that finally cause a cell to go nuts. Okay. Now, unregulated cell division leads to the production of tumors, for the most part. There are some cancers that don't produce tumors, like leukemia. But for the most part, they do. Some tumors are very solid, some tumors are really spread out. Now, it turns out that not all tumors are actually a problem. Some are benign. Benign means they've undergone replication, but they're not invading nearby cells or traveling around. So if they come in contact, let's say, with another type of tissue, they stop. Now, cancer is different. Cancer actually causes a tumor that has lost what's called contact inhibition. Contact inhibition means that when I talked about the benign tumor, it comes up against another tissue and cell, it stops dividing on contact. Well, with cancer, it keeps dividing, and then invading that tissue. So malignant cells or cancer cells are invasive. That's their definition. So we have a tumor can either go one or two ways. It can go, it forms a tumor, it's a benign tumor. Now, of course, benign tumors are obviously much less dangerous for the most part than cancerous tumors. But you can get a benign tumor in a place that's really bad and there's not much they can do for you. So for example, there's a lot of pituitary gland tumors in your brain it's a common tumor. It's usually a benign tumor, but it's very, very difficult to operate on it. If something happens and it's actually invasive, then it's a malignant cell. Okay, so remember, it's invasive if it's lost contact inhibition. Now, cancer cells do a whole bunch of things. One of the things they can do is that they can travel around. So some cancers are called metastatic. And that means the cancers can travel from one place to another, the cells, and then cause new tumors all over the place. When a cell is, when a cancer becomes metastatic, it means that you're in bad doo-doo. Some cells, cancers never become metastatic. They just form a tumor in place, and those are usually curable. Now that's because they have something called anchorage dependence. They just don't go floating off and into the lymph or the bloodstream to move around. But if a cell loses, let's say, proteins that make it adhere to other cells, then it might, in fact, go off and metastasize all over the place. A cell might start out as just invasive, but still have anchorage dependence. But then a future mutation might, in fact, make it metastatic. Okay. There's also something else I want to talk about. Cancer cells are like other cells. They need nutrients. They need oxygen. All sorts of different things. So, when cells are dividing, let's say a lot of division during development or something, cells emit with growth factors, or proteins that initiate cell growth and replication. And when they do that, they also tend to initiate the formation of blood vessels, because cancer needs the same nutrients that your cell does. So cancer tends to initiate near it a blood supply that it can use for itself. That's why a lot of people with end-stage cancer, they look very, very thin. It's because that cancer is using all the energy and burning it up for its own multiplication. So we have a normal cell. We have dividing. Let's say this cell is a little bit different, potentially unregulated growth, right? It forms a tumor. If it's benign, it forms a tumor in place and doesn't travel. If it's malignant, it invades surrounding tissue. It's metastatic, it's on the move. Okay. I mentioned earlier carcinogens. There's all kinds of them. There's some that we introduce into our own environment, like smoking. There's others that might just be around, like you might be eating a plant that has a certain compound that causes cancer. It's part of the defensive compound that a plant might have. So it could be in your diet that there's a carcinogen. You could be exposed to radiation, like radium. Some people drink water and there's actually a lot of radium in it, and they're more likely, let's say, to develop cancer. So that radium is a carcinogen as well. Now, in this case, carcinogens cause direct damage to cells. And or others do other things, like there's they're finding that a lot of stuff that's given to animals to make them grow better affect estrogens and testosterones and reproductive hormones, among other things. And that they're getting released into the system all the time, where they wouldn't normally be. So you can, that kind of situation too. Now, it turns out that in terms of lung cancer, 90% of lung cancer is due to smoking, and also mouth and esophageal are things that areas that get cancer from smoking. Of course, some people are vaping now, so they're not getting a lot of the carcinogens, because nicotine itself is not a carcinogen. Let's see. These are a whole bunch of other carcinogens around there that you can see. Cadmium, candle wax, industrial solvent, toluene, nicotine, that's insecticide rather, ammonia, paint, lead paint, methanol, carbon monoxide, arsenic poisoning, acetic acid, a whole bunch of stuff. It's amazing. Our environment is actually stocked full of things that are trying to kill us. They really are out to get us. It's just that you can't escape it. It's really just a bummer. I guess you could put yourself in a bubble, but at the same time, that wouldn't be very fun either. Oh,